Greetings. I'm so glad that we're all here. I'm Ken Bamberger, the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Law here at UC Berkeley and co-director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. And I want to welcome you to the Helen Diller Institute's 16th annual Robbins Collection Lecture on Jewish Law, Thought, and Identity with Professor Christine Hayes, Sterling Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Yale University. This lecture was born of a now decade-and-a-half long partnership between the Diller Institute and the law school's Robbins Collection for Religious and Civil Law, which is a vibrant sector for research that holds right here at Berkeley Law one of the nation's largest collections of religious and Jewish law texts and together we have brought amazing lecturers, including in past years Moshe Halbertal, Suzanne Stone, Michael Walzer, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Susanna Heschel, and last year Yippee Kurtzer. We're so grateful to Professor Laura Ali, the director of Robbins, and to the whole staff of the Robbins Collection who are here today. Thank you. Thank you so much. And this year, we're also pleased to acknowledge the following co-sponsors: the Center for Jewish Studies, the Center for the Study of Religion, and the Department of Languages and Cultures. And Professor Hayes actually received her PhD from UC Berkeley in what was then called Near Eastern Studies, today's MELC. A bit about the Helen Diller Institute. Through its two programs, one the program on Jewish law, and one the campus's Israel Studies program, the Helen Diller Institute provides a rich academic forum for students and faculty. Currently, the Institute houses an undergraduate fellowship of nearly 40 students, brings visiting faculty from Israel and U.S. universities to teach and research at Berkeley, hosts the university's new undergraduate minor in Israel Studies, and offers dozens of lectures and programs for the campus communities and also, as tonight, for the public. All of our programs, everything, is enabled entirely by philanthropic support. So we're grateful to all our supporters, and to those of you who are here today, thank you for your partnership. You can learn more about supporting the Institute and also find information about our upcoming public lectures this semester, including the Levitsky Lecture on Israel and the United Nations with international law scholar and former Hebrew Law School Dean Yuval Shani, that's March 12th, and a visit by leading Israeli journalist Nadav Eyal on April 22nd. You can also find on our website recordings of past programs. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Professor Christine Hayes as our distinguished Robbins Collection lecturer. Professor Hayes is the Sterling Professor of Religious Studies in Classical Judaic at Yale University, a faculty she joined in 1996. And this semester, she's the Gross Visiting Professor of Jewish Law at Penn Law School, having served last year as the Gross Visiting Professor in Jewish Law at Harvard Law School. Her scholarship is wide and deep, and I note for those who have not yet indulged, very engaging. Her numerous books include, among others, Between the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds, which won the Salo Baron Prize for Jewish Thought and Literature, the book Gentile Impurities and Jewish Identities, Intermarriage and Conversion from the Bible to the Talmud, a National Jewish Book Award finalist, and broad works like The Emergence of Judaism and The Introduction to the Bible. Professor Hayes takes on small topics, as well as influential edited volumes that include Jewish Law and its Interactions with Other Legal Systems, and the Cambridge Companion to Judaism and Law. Professor Hayes' most recent book, What's Divine About Divine Law, received a National Jewish Book Award, a Prose Award for Best Book in Theology and Religious Studies from the American Publishers Association, and the Schnitzer Best Book Award from the Association of Jewish Studies. And Professor Hayes has served as editor for the Association for Jewish Studies Review, the president of the Association for Jewish Studies, and the chair of the Religion Department at Yale. She's also currently a senior faculty fellow with the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Finally, Professor Hayes is a legendary teacher, and she was awarded Yale's Klaus Prize for teaching excellence in the humanities. And I have to admit that I have some inside knowledge about all of this. My oldest son, Max, is a senior at Yale College, and I know directly from him and from all of his friends what a beloved, inspiring, transformative teacher and model for her students Professor Hayes is. It's truly an honor to have you at Berkeley Law. Please join me in welcoming Professor Christine.
Thank you to you and to the Institute for the invitation to deliver the 2025 Robbins Lecture. I'm honored and delighted to do so. I also want to thank Dr. Goldberg for her logistical assistance through this whole process, as well as Juan Zavala. They've been terrific and made everything just so easy so far. So scholars of divine law in Western culture have had difficulty accounting for the Talmud's conception of divine law. And that's because the Talmud's conception of divine law doesn't align with the prevailing scholarly definition of divine law. That scholarly definition is formed by the Greek philosophical conception of divine law as an absolute and immutable law that transcends history. But as I argued in my last book, What's Divine About Divine Law, the Talmudic rabbis understood divine law as a dynamic and contingent phenomenon that unfolds in and through historical time, and scholars have had trouble accounting for that. So in my lecture today, I'd like to do two things. First, I will briefly review the argument of my last book for what Talmudic divine law is not. I will show that the rabbis broke with the Greek philosophical tradition's conception of divine law as an immutable rational order transcending history and all its contingencies. And then second, I will preview the argument of the book I am currently writing, which provides a positive account of what Talmudic divine law is. And I will argue that the alternative Talmudic conception of divine law, in which history and contingency play a vital role, is best illuminated by deploying such modern theoretical lenses as humor theory, performance studies, and theories of play. So to begin our negative account first of what Talmudic law is not, we must review the conception of divine law that emerged from the Greek philosophical tradition, especially from the Stoics, because it was a popular version of their view that would pervade the Hellenistic and later Roman East and become a mainstay of Christian theology and eventually a mainstay of the Western intellectual and academic tradition. The Stoics rejected the sophists' assertion that law and morality are purely conventional. The Stoics wanted to base law and morality on something secure, something transcending mere human convention. And they chose nature. And that was a radical innovation. It broke with a long-standing Greek tradition that for the most part saw nature, physis, as chaotic and antithetical to law, nomos. The laws of the state rescue us from the chaos of nature. Against that tradition, the Stoics asserted that nature was not chaotic and disordered. It was governed by an inherent reason, or logos. Now, for the Stoics, nature is coextensive with God. Nature is divine. So the logos inherent in nature, the natural law, is also the divine law, theos nomos, and excuse me, an unwritten and immutable rational order that animates and governs the cosmos. So the Stoics arrived at this revolutionary idea by combining four previously distinct concepts: nature, God, reason, and law, creating the idea of a divine law, or logos, reason, that transcends historical time and is therefore immutable, universal, and true, not historically contingent or conditioned. According to the Stoics, The perfectly rational sage who perceives the divine logos embedded in nature will order himself accordingly and achieve virtue through his own rational nature. But alas, humans in general lack the rational perfection needed to perceive the divine logos, that is the source of true virtue. So instead of being guided by the divine law of reason, we must institute written laws that coerce us to a basic civility and obedience, which is rather less than true rational virtue. So human positive laws of the state are a second best accommodation to our rational imperfection. So the Stoics, consistent with Greek political philosophy generally, distinguished divine law, the rational order governing the cosmos, from human positive law, the written legislation and rules of political states that are particular, not universal. They're grounded in and backed by the will of a sovereign authority rather than universal reason. Human laws are not necessarily true. I don't stop at a red light because stopping at redness is a universal rational truth. Positive human laws are historically conditioned and contingent. They change in response to the inevitably shifting circumstances of life in the material world, of generation and decay. And while we should aspire to bring our human laws into accord with natural reason, that remains always an aspiration. No written law, no articulated law represents the divine logos, reason, nor can written law bring true virtue. Written laws are by definition historically embedded, particular, contingent, and human. The divine law is by definition unwritten. It is logos, or reason itself, transhistorical, universal, and absolute. So this dichotomy of the unwritten divine law and the written human legislation of political states is basic to all Hellenistic conceptions of law, and it's represented in the chart that's on the back of your handout. So if you flip over to the back of your handout, you'll see two columns. And according to the Greek philosophical tradition I've just described, right, a tradition that would permeate the Hellenistic East, divine law is on the left-hand column. It is transhistorical, it is unwritten, it is logos itself, reason, embedded in nature. So therefore, it's rational, and it is always necessarily true, and it's universal, absolute, and immutable. Human law, I've represented in the second column on the right. It is the opposite. It is historically conditioned. It is articulated in words, either oral or written, legislation. It's grounded in a sovereign will, not necessarily reason, and therefore it is not necessarily rational or true. There can be arbitrary commands and conventions. And it's particular, contingent, and mutable. No particular written law can claim to be the divine law. That would be a contradiction in terms. But there is, of course, an alternative tradition of divine law in antiquity that claimed precisely what the Stoic tradition would reject out of hand. The biblical conception of divine law is of a body of written, positive legislation given not to universal humankind, but to a particular people at Sinai, the Israelites, in order to enable the establishment of one political community in a particular place, the land of Israel. This Mosaic law is said to be divine, not because it is the unwritten and universal rational order of the cosmos. It's divine because it's authored by and is the command of a deity. To say it is divine is to point to its source, not its character as rational, true, universal, or immutable. Some laws of the Torah are rational, certainly, but some, such as the dietary laws and purity taboos, are not. In fact, it's precisely because they are non-rational and thus not universally observed, other peoples don't reason their way to them, that they can serve to separate Israel from other nations, l'kadesh, to render Israel separate and the holy people of God. The Mosaic law is not transhistorical. It's given to a community at a particular point in its history. And because it is historically embedded and contingent, it's not immutable, it's adjusted as new situations arise in historical time. Biblical narratives record instances of legal change by God himself, by Moses and others due to new circumstances. So in the dominant biblical discourse of divine law, the divine law is written legislation for a particular political community, not universal humankind. It's embedded in history and it's therefore historically responsive and contingent. And this conception of divine law stands in stark contrast to the prevailing and largely Stoic conception of divine law as an unwritten rational order embedded in nature, and therefore transhistorical and absolute. So these distinctive discourses of divine law collided head-on after Alexander decided to conquer the eastern end of the Mediterranean, creating a cognitive dissonance for Jews living under Hellenistic influence, because the divine law of biblical tradition possessed the features that the Greek philosophical tradition attributed to human law, not divine law. All those features on the right side of the chart that you have on your handout. And this incongruity was obvious to ancient Jews, and they responded to the cognitive dissonance, the incongruity, in different ways. And my newest work argues that these responses can be illuminated by humor theory. The most widely accepted theory of humor is the incongruity theory, which holds that, to quote one theorist, humor is found primarily in an intellectual recognition of an absurd incongruity between conflicting ideas or experiences. According to this theorist, John Morial, humor is a cognitive phenomenon in which perceptions, thoughts, mental patterns, and expectations undergo a change of cognitive state or a cognitive shift that is abrupt or sudden, but also pleasurable. He summarizes these four features by saying, in humor, we enjoy cognitive shifts, incongruities. Now, of course, we don't laugh at all incongruities. That's because not all incongruities are experienced as pleasurable. There are two hardwired human responses to incongruity. The first is a negative response, ranging from distress and fear to puzzlement. Great distress arises when we perceive an incongruity as a dangerous threat to ourselves or our values, like finding a bomb on the front seat of your car or seeing a parent beat a child in public. These incongruities are not funny, they're dangerous, or they're distressing. Some incongruities may be perceived as simply puzzling, like finding a pumpkin in the bathtub, which is perplexing, and one wants to figure out why it is there. Whether dangerous or merely perplexing, we don't find these incongruities amusing. If they're dangerous, we work to eliminate them, and if they're perplexing, we work to resolve them. But there's also a positive response to incongruity. When an incongruity is perceived as non-threatening and non-perplexing, we simply enjoy it. And far from wanting to eliminate it or resolve it, because we're amused, we want to prolong it and repeat it. So incongruity has always provoked these basic responses in human beings, and sometimes one group will react to an incongruity with distress and work to eliminate it, while another group will react to the exact same incongruity with humorous delight and seek to prolong and intensify it. And the contrast tells us who was threatened by the incongruity and who was not. So going back to the ancients, ancient Jews could not help but be aware of the incongruity between the biblical and the Hellenistic conceptions of divine law, and they responded to the incongruity in different ways. For some Jews who admired Hellenistic culture, the encounter with the Hellenistic conception of divine law was distressing. They didn't want others to think of their tradition, their law. They didn't themselves want to think of their tradition, their law, as anything less than divine. And they worked to align the divine law of biblical tradition with the philosophical conception of divine law, attributing to it the characteristics in the left column of your chart. So they claimed that the law given to Moses was divine according to the definition of divine law that prevailed in the Hellenistic culture that they so admired and emulated, which meant that the written law given at Sinai was rational, universally true, and immutable. We see these claims in works like the Letter of Aristeas, written by a Hellenistic Jewish author in the 2nd century BCE, in which the Jewish protagonist, in conversation with certain philosophers, asserts that the Mosaic law was, quote, not laid down at random, but with a view to truth, aletheia, and as a token of right reason, orthos logos. And the dietary laws and the purity laws in particular, which may appear to be unnatural and irrational, are in fact highly rational if read allegorically and lead to moral virtue. Similar claims are made by the author of a work known as 4th Maccabees. Here again, a Jewish protagonist is speaking to an outsider who looks at his law and thinks it's absurd and bizarre and doesn't have the characteristics of divine law. This is a mocking tyrant who says that the law of the Judeans is not rational, and he responds that indeed it is, and perfectly in accordance with nature, and especially the dietary and purity laws that seem non-rational. They train Jews to develop the virtues of Hellenistic culture. But as is well known, it's the 1st century Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria who goes the farthest in repackaging the positive legislation of the biblical covenant as the Stoic natural law. Philo is also sensitive to those who ridiculed Scripture and scriptural law for possessing features that appear incongruous for a law claiming to be divine. He was angered and distressed by these mockers, and Philo denied the incongruity. He insisted that the Mosaic law is divine according to the criteria accepted by the broader Hellenistic environment. All of the particular enactments of the law, he writes, are in agreement with the principles of eternal nature. Having identified the Mosaic law with the divine natural law of Stoic tradition, Philo goes on to show that it contains rational and philosophical truth. He says, "You will not find anything mythical or fictional but the canons of truth all inscribed in it." He shows that it is not the law of a particular people. It's actually the law of the universal world city, which other nations will one day realize and adopt as their own. He argues that it has never changed from the time of Moses. It's been completely immutable, and that its written form is simply a copy of, or an icon of, an unwritten original. It is actually an unwritten law. And what we have in writing is simply an icon or copy of an original unwritten law of nature, which we know is true because the patriarchs who lived before the law was given in writing at Sinai were able to perceive through their rational perfection the Torah in nature, written in nature, and to follow it as perfect, virtuous sages. So for Philo and other Hellenized Jews who accepted the Hellenistic definition of divine law, the incongruity between this definition and the biblical conception of divine law was distressing, and it had to be eliminated by refashioning the historically embedded and contingent divine Torah of Moses into the transhistorical and absolute natural law of the Greek philosophical tradition. But not all Jews reacted negatively to this obvious incongruity. The Talmudic rabbis who flourished from the late 1st to the 7th century in both Palestine and then Babylonia were also aware of the incongruity and were, generally speaking, there are some exceptions, unapologetic. And we know this because they too composed dialogues and stories that depict outsiders mocking those elements of the Mosaic legislation that appear incongruous for a divine law on the Greek definition. But unlike the Hellenistic Jewish writings we have seen, the rabbis did not rush to remove the incongruity by asserting that the law of Moses is in fact universal, immutable, rational truth, as Philo did. Instead, they doubled down on the incongruity. They treated it with humor, they prolonged it, and even intensified it. Against prevailing Hellenistic conceptions of divine law, they asserted the biblical conception of divine law as a written body of legislation given at a historical time and place that's not universal, immutable, rational truth. And the resulting portrait of divine law as sometimes deviating from truth, deviating from rationality, sometimes in need of updating and repair, can be pretty funny to those aware of the Hellenistic alternative that it's seeking to undermine. And that's precisely how the rabbis wanted it, I would argue, because humor is one of the most effective weapons for dismantling a mistaken reverence for something that is not, in fact, immutable and absolute. So the Torah is not consistently represented in rabbinic texts as intrinsically rational or universally accessible by reason. Indeed, in hundreds of texts, early and late, Palestinian and Babylonian, the Mosaic law is portrayed as a divine decree containing some commandments that are not only non-rational but actually run counter to human nature or are so illogical as to inspire mockery on the part of nations looking on. The rabbis delight in pointing to laws on matters large and small that cannot be derived by reason and had to be given as commands of the divine sovereign, or we would have reasoned our way to something incorrect. One particularly striking text consists of an extended celebration of the irrationality of the law of the red heifer. This is the ritual that purifies a person who has corpse impurity, and the paradoxical and irrational nature of this particular ritual law is championed, elevated, and hailed as proof of its divinity. Only a divine being, the text says, can generate paradoxes like this that transcend reason, a stark contrast to the apologetic and rationalistic approach of the Hellenistic Jewish sources that divinized reason and felt compelled, therefore, to prove the rationality of even the purity laws. But for the rabbis, to declare reason divine is tantamount to idolatry. For the rabbis, divine law cannot be reduced to reason. It's not exhausted by reason or ultimately beholden to it. Nor do the rabbis insist that the Torah's rulings align with various standards of truth, such as, for example, factual truth. We see this when the rabbis determine the law over and against empirical realities, tolerating legal fictions and contrary to fact rulings, if doing so will achieve humane and compassionate goals. In one passage in the Talmud, women are presumed to be in a state of ritual purity when their husbands return from a journey, even though this will not be factually true at least 25% of the time. But the facts are less important than promoting marital intimacy after separation or procreation. In another famous passage, The rabbinic court sets the calendar and the holy days in defiance of the astronomical reality as indicated by the movement of planets and things that I don't know anything about. But it's clear that they're willing to defy what the moon is doing for various pragmatic reasons, prompting this humorous comment. When all the ministering angels assemble before God to set the calendar, according to the movements of the heavenly bodies, they ask, Lord of the universe, when is the new year? And he answers them, you're asking me? You and I should ask the human court. The incongruous portrait of ministering angels waiting for the human court to declare the new year, as if time depends on the actions of mortals, coupled with the portrait of a divine being who literally doesn't have a clue what time it is not threatening to the rabbis, but funny. This kind of nominalist approach to the law, right, is not uncommon in a system of human law. We're very accustomed to this idea that the law is what we make it or name it to be, right, the nominalist approach to law, in a system of human law. But on a Stoic understanding of divine law, such a deviation would be unimaginable, the idea that the divine law could anyway deviate somehow from natural reality. Similarly, in judicial contexts, an uncompromising adherence to truth, meaning assigning guilt and innocence by strict standards of justice without moderation by other values or considerations, is depicted in several Talmudic and rabbinic texts as dangerous. It's said that Jerusalem was destroyed precisely because people gave judgments according to the strict or formal law of the Torah, din ha-Torah, when they should have stopped short of the strict or formal law and stayed lifnim mishurat adin, stayed inside the law, and exercised compassion. Another rabbinic source notes that Torah judges who render justice in a formally correct way that ignores particular circumstances are destructive, cutting through the mountain, as the rabbis say. A pious judge, by contrast, will contextualize the law, balance strict justice with other important values, compassion, modesty, peace, charity, and other virtues, must sometimes trump the formal legal truth. God himself is depicted as defeating truth in favor of mercy and compassion in the heavenly court, where he actually encourages the advocates to bribe him, and privileges those who are pleading for mercy and so on, corrupting the law from its adherence to truth. So, according to the rabbinic conception of divine law, it is not necessarily rational, it is not necessarily true, and now the third characteristic of Stoic divine law, it is not necessarily immutable. The rabbis resist the prevailing definition of divine law as something static and unchanging. The Talmud contains numerous rulings that adjust the divine law for the sake of the social order or the public welfare. For example, although according to the Torah law, a husband is empowered to annul a divorce document without his wife's knowledge, the rabbis ruled that he may not do so for the sake of the social order. On literally hundreds of occasions, the rabbis debate and explicitly modify the law in a deliberative response to changing historical, social, ethical, and ideological circumstances. Such texts suggest that humans are God's essential partners in the project of Torah. Humans critique the law and improve it based on their experience as embodied beings living in an uncertain world. As one scholar has recently shown, Dov Weiss, in a book called Pious Irreverence, Palestinian rabbinic works contain more than 100 instances in which humans are depicted as advancing criticism of divine decrees or mores. Sometimes the deity gets defensive, but sometimes the deity concedes, even declaring on 3 occasions, by your life you've taught me something, before then revising the divine law or the principle in question. These often very humorous texts depict a God in need of information, feedback, and moral instruction by humans. Indeed, in a very often quoted text from the Babylonian Talmud, God is said to take delight in the rabbi's ability to defeat him in legal disputation. But the idea of a morally evolving divine being who gives a morally evolving law that is test-driven by humans as it rolls out of the pristine factory of heaven, subjected to moral scrutiny, a law that's modified if necessary. This view stands at a great distance from Hellenistic conceptions, according to which the perfect natural or divine law is an expression of a universally valid and immutable rational order. For a Stoic or for Philo, the idea of adjusting the divine law would make as much sense as repealing the law of gravity. But for the rabbis, the responsive flexibility of the divine legislation of God's Torah is not a weakness, but a strength, not a bug, but a feature, and an indicator of its origin in a dynamic and responsive divine will. Surely a static, unchanging law would hardly be divine. It would not support human flourishing. So why did the rabbis refuse to attribute to the Torah the qualities that the surrounding culture deemed to be the defining characteristics of divine law, particularly its claim to a single and absolute rational truth? I maintain that it's because the rabbis, oh, I'm sorry, should I be doing something different? Oh, water, thank you. Good idea. I think it was bothering him more than me, so I think I'll take more. So I maintain that it's because the rabbis were suspicious, if not downright skeptical, of dogmatic claims of absolute moral truth. And I don't mean that the rabbis did not value truthfulness. They frequently and explicitly condemn prevarication and deceit. But they understood that there are some pursuits to which the categories truth and falsity do not apply. In this respect, they resemble Aristotle, who noted that while universal, exceptionless truth may be attainable in purely rational domains like logic and geometry, it is unattainable in the realm of practical and moral affairs. When deliberating over the morality of an action, we appeal not to concepts of truth and falsehood, but to concepts of good and bad, which are not easily universalized or absolutized. However good a general rule or law might be in theory, and however well a previous moral decision may have served us in the past, it is entirely possible that it is not the best course of action in a new and slightly different circumstance. We must ask, do the demands of the hour indicate that a modification of the earlier rule or decision would be a better course of action? To determine what it is best to do in any given situation requires a particularized judgment through moral reasoning. Moral reasoning does not prove that something is immutably true. It argues that something is, after consideration of all relevant factors, good today, and maybe often, and if we deliberated really well, then maybe for a very long time, but never absolutely and immutably, because the circumstances of life are ever shifting and we can never imagine them all or take all possibilities into account. So with apologies to the Stoics, wouldn't a truly divine law, one that can support human flourishing now and in the future, have to be dynamic and responsive rather than absolute and immutable? Wouldn't it have to be open to moral critique and revision as new situations, new challenges, new information, and new moral insights arise? The refusal to absolutize any one value, such as truth or rationality, should not be confused with the refusal of all values or relativism. The rabbi's position is not a value-less position. It is a value-rich position. Rabbinic sources eulogize many virtues and values, especially truthfulness and compassion and modesty, and they even hierarchize them on occasion, but they refuse to install any one value as permanently and absolutely supreme. They recognize that each moment of moral judgment requires the dynamic activation, weighing, and balancing of those strongly held values to determine the morally best course of action while avoiding a dogmatic absolutism. And again, Aristotle thought this was true, but he thought it was true of human law, because human law is flawed and imperfect. The rabbis are saying it is true of divine law precisely because it is perfect. So I suggest that the rabbis' opposition to the prevailing Hellenistic construction of divine law as a transhistorical and universal absolute can be organized under the figure of the jester. In his essay, The Priest and the Jester, Leszek Kolakowski proposes the jester as representing an attitude of negative vigilance in the face of any absolute. He writes, "The antagonism between a philosophy consolidating the absolute and a philosophy questioning the accepted absolutes appears to be incurable. It is the antagonism of a priest and a jester. And in almost every historical epoch, the priest is the guardian of the absolute who upholds the cult of the final and the obvious contained in the tradition. The jester is he who questions what appears to be self-evident. The philosophy of the jester denounces as doubtful what appears as unshakable. It points out the contradictions in what seems evident and incontestable. It ridicules common sense and reads sense into the absurd. The jester's attitude is an endless attempt to reflect on the various arguments of contradictory ideas, an attitude dialectical by its very nature, simply to overcome what is because it is. A jester does not jeer out of sheer contrariness. He jeers because he mistrusts the stabilized world." So I've argued that the rabbis resisted and even dismantled prevailing notions of divine law as a transhistorical and universal, immutable, rational truth, and that they did so using humor. But to stop here is to give only a negative account of the rabbis as deconstructing the prevailing view in their ambient culture? Can we provide a positive account of the rabbinic conception of divine law, focusing not on what it isn't, but on what it is? Well, to date, scholars of divine law have failed to do so, and indeed, scholarship on the concept of natural law or divine law in the West has generally ignored the Talmudic conception of divine law because it appears to lack what is taken to be the defining quality of divine law, static, transhistorical immutability. Now, in the West, scholarship on divine law generally resides in the discipline of philosophy. And Western philosophy deploys analytical categories that privilege the transhistorical and the absolute. So it views the rabbinic conception of historically embedded and contingent divine law as quaint and unsophisticated at best, illogical, wrong-headed, or irrelevant at worst. So if we want to offer a positive account of the rabbinic conception of divine law as more than a destabilizing resistance movement, we need theoretical models and analytical tools other than those provided by the Western philosophical tradition. We need theoretical models in which the historical and the contingent are not irrelevant or inferior categories, but central and essential. I will argue that these tools and models are provided by contemporary performance studies and play theory. Because they privilege the historical and the contingent, these theoretical approaches enable a robust account of the rabbinic conception of divine law and the underlying epistemology upon which it is based. To state the case more plainly, if in biblical and rabbinic tradition, divine law is not a static and transhistorical absolute, but a particular and contingent body of legislation responsive to and generative of the perpetual dynamism that characterizes the realm of generation and decay of which humans are a part, then it is performative. And for this reason, the theoretical lens offered by contemporary performance studies can illuminate the rabbinic conception of divine law. Performance studies values performance, which consists of action, as an object of study in itself. According to Richard Schechner, the field considers a performance to be any action that is framed, presented, highlighted, or displayed. Performing assumes both an audience and a consciousness that one is showing or performing. Performance can occur outside of formal performance contexts, and performativity is a term that refers to events and actions, even everyday actions, that have performance-like qualities. So performance studies holds that many activities can be analyzed as performance. They can be interrogated in terms of their performativity. The rabbinic elaboration of divine law in the Talmud can be interrogated in terms of its performativity. So the first text that you have on the front of your handout may serve as a brief example. Here's a case of a woman who poses a question about a blood stain. Is it menstrual blood, and therefore she is impure and disqualified for sexual relations with her husband, or not? So this is from the Mishnah. A woman once came to Rabbi Akiva and said to him, I have observed a blood stain, and I don't know whether it's menstrual blood. He said to her, did you perhaps have a wound? And she said, well, yes, but it's scabbed over. He said to her, yeah, but is it possible that it opened again and bled? And she said, yes. And Rabbi Akiva declared her pure. Notice that I performed that, right? You noticed that. When he saw that his disciples were looking at one another in astonishment, he said, why do you find this difficult? Since the sages didn't lay down the rule in order to be stringent, but in order to be lenient. For scripture says, if a woman has a flow, and her flow in her flesh be blood, meaning only flowing blood is of legal consequence, not a blood stain. So we don't have to be strict about that. When the story begins, we think we're alone in witnessing a private dialogue between Rabbi Akiva and a woman. But we soon discover that we're not the only observers. Others are watching, and their gaze confirms the status of Rabbi Akiva's interaction with the woman as a performance. So we take a seat with them in the audience, and we find that their reaction to the performance informs ours. They are astonished, and we understand that we too should be astonished. Why? What is astonishing about Rabbi Akiva's performance of the law? The situation described is a situation of doubt. The status of the woman's blood stain as menstrual or non-menstrual in origin cannot be determined as a matter of fact, and so a legal presumption is required. Rabbi Akiva adopts the presumption that the blood is non-menstrual based on some far-fetched witness leading that strains credulity, and then in what seems very much like an after-the-fact justification, Rabbi Akiva offers a scriptural support for the policy of adopting lenient presumptions in cases involving blood stains rather than fresh blood. Rabbi Akiva, in other words, steps outside the known boundary of the law and then pulls the boundary up after him so that he is no longer outside it. the amazed disciples who have recruited us to their ranks serve as a literary device by means of which the author of the text highlights and champions the highly performative, contingent, dynamic, and generative nature of Rabbi Akiva's elaboration of the divine law. The rabbis were keenly aware that the presence of disciples rendered their every move a performance that could make or unmake the law. Consider another story, the second one on your handout. This is now from the Babylonian Talmud. The law in question concerns the proper posture to be assumed for the twice daily recitation of the Shema prayer. According to the school of Hillel, the prayer may be recited standing, sitting, or reclining. But according to the school of Shammai, one must stand to recite the prayer in the morning and recline in the evening. The Talmud tells us of two early rabbis who are dining together when the time to recite the evening prayer arrived, which is when the school of Shammai says you must recline. So this is from the Babylonian Talmud Brachot. Once Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah were dining at the same place, and Rabbi Yishmael was reclining while Rabbi Elazar was standing upright. When the time came for reciting the evening Shema, Rabbi Elazar reclined and Rabbi Yishmael stood upright. Said Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah to Rabbi Yishmael, Brother Yishmael, are you simply being contrary? Is a longer phrase there, but I shortened it. It basically amounts to, are you cutting off your nose to spite your face? As long as I was upright, you were reclining. Now that I recline, you're standing upright. Are you just trying to do the opposite of me? And he replied, I have acted according to the rule of the school of Hillel, and you have acted according to the rule of the school of Shammai. And what is more, I had to act thus, lest the disciples should see and fix the law according to the opinion of the school of Shammai for future generations. So let me break this down for you. Both rabbis changed their positions. Now, if Rabbi Yishmael follows the school of Hillel, which allows any position, surely he could have just remained reclining. He didn't actually have to stand up. Why then did he stand? Because of the potential gaze of a potential audience and the desire to communicate the law's disputed status. Were Rabbi Yishmael to remain reclining alongside Rabbi Eliezer, who from standing then reclined, an observer might think that the law has been decided according to the opinion of the school of Shammai. So to prevent this, Rabbi Yishmael stands to indicate to a group of onlookers off stage, not that the school of Hillel is right, but that this law, like so many others, has not been resolved and there is no single or absolute position. Rabbi Yishmael's performance prevented the erasure of one legal view. Rabbi Akiva's performance of the law created something new. In other words, both performances do something. They have an effect in the world, and this resonates with the concept of the performative, as described by J.L. Austin in How to Do Things with Words. The central idea behind the concept of the performative, of course, is that language can actually do things. With this ring, I thee wed actually creates a marriage and transforms a single person into a married person. The transformative quality of what John Searle, here at Berkeley, called speech acts is expressed by performative theorists as efficacy, which is the ability of speech, language, and performative events and actions to effect change. Law is by its very nature highly performative, creating and transforming realities through speech acts and other behaviors that are framed and executed in a manner that is deemed efficacious. Divine law and rabbinic tradition is no different. And this brings us to an additional and central theme of performance studies, and that is the relation of performance to the real and to truth. This question has a long history with distinct approaches that may be grouped in two very broad categories for our purposes here, and please forgive the very reductive sketch. I know it's reductive. According to one approach, performance is mimetic. It's an unreal illusion that only points to a transhistorical reality or truth. It's often noted that Plato, as the champion of truth, famously banned all actors and poets from his ideal republic because they trade in lies. For Plato, so it is argued, the ordinary reality that we live in is already a shadow of the ideal forms of the real and the true. So theater, as an embodied imitation or mimesis of this world, these shadows, is at a second remove from all that is real and true. Aristotle was kinder to the theater and its ability to reflect reality, but this idea that theater imitates or reflects a separate true reality was a dominant idea from ancient Greece to Renaissance Europe. When Hamlet proposes staging a play in order to expose the truth of his uncle's fratricide, he exclaims, "The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." In his role as director, Hamlet tells the players that the purpose of playing was and is to hold, as it were, the mirror up to nature. But according to a second approach to performance, there is no stable and static reality to reflect. Reality itself is a dynamic process, and therefore reality is not reflected by performance, but constructed through it. On this approach, every action, every idea is a process and a performance. So instead of the stable representation of static originals, there is only dynamic performance generating provisional meanings. Paraphrasing Hamlet, Brecht argued that art is not a mirror held up to nature, but a hammer with which to shape it. So when performance is not about reflecting or expressing truth, but creating it, then it becomes a kind of play. Play is a form of activity that, despite possessing clear rules and structure, is undetermined in its outcome. It's a structured activity with an undetermined outcome. It exists only as long as there are players to sustain it. And I submit that the classic rabbinic corpus of divine law, the Babylonian Talmud, with its famously labyrinthine legal discussions, is best understood in terms of performance, a dynamic activity that generates provisional meanings, rather than unveiling absolute truths, and play, a structured activity with an undetermined outcome. I'll say a little bit about performance now. Tomorrow I'll be talking a little bit more about play. First of all, the Talmud's argumentation is staged like a performance. A ringmaster, or puppeteer perhaps, the anonymous voice of the Talmud that we refer to as the Stam, controls a diverse cast of characters. Rabbinic figures from diverse times and places are set on the stage by the Stam, by the anonymous narrator, and made to interact and perform. They speak, they object, they respond to objections, they draw inferences, they register agreement or disagreement, and as we shall see in a moment, they bring new things into being. But these highly choreographed performances are also a kind of play in which the Stam deploys an ever-increasing level of detail and specificity in a concerted effort to destabilize knowledge, to undermine certainty, to defer final answers, and keep the game going. I'll offer two quick examples, one patently funny and the other entirely serious. And if your head spins, that's okay. It will prove my final point. So in one Talmudic discussion, a certain rabbi says that a sukkah, right, the ceremonial hut constructed for the observance of a particular holiday, may be constructed using an animal for one of the three required walls. Another sage, Rabbi Meir, prohibits the use of an animal as one of the required walls of a sukkah. Why does he prohibit it? Two sages living 2 centuries later and hundreds of miles away suggest reasons. One says Rabbi Meir fears the animal will run away, and another says Rabbi Meir fears that it will die. The Stam that's orchestrating this discussion asks whether and when these different understandings of the reason for Rabbi Meir's prohibition might lead to different rulings in different situations, and the game is now afoot. The Stam responds to its own question, as it so often does. What if someone builds a sukkah using an elephant who's tied up as one of its walls? If Rabbi Meir prohibits animal walls because he fears the animal will wander off, well, this elephant is tied, so Rabbi Meir would not prohibit this animal-walled sukkah. But if Rabbi Meir prohibits animal walls because he fears the animal will die, this elephant might die, so he would prohibit this sukkah. So it matters what his reason is. But the Stam isn't done. Perhaps Rabbi Meir's fear of the animal dying wouldn't apply in the case of an elephant, because an elephant is so large that even when dead, its carcass will still meet the minimum height required for a wall, I'm glad you're laughing, for a wall to be a valid sukkah wall. So maybe he would permit the case of a tied elephant, whether the reason for his prohibition is fear the animal will bolt or fear the animal will die. If knowing the reason for Rabbi Meir's prohibition makes no practical difference in the case of a tied-up elephant wall, perhaps it makes a difference in the case of a non-elephant quadruped like a cow. A cow is smaller, and if it dies, its carcass will not reach the minimum height required for a wall to be a valid sukkah wall. So if Rabbi Meir's prohibition is based on the fear the animal will die and fall below the minimum height, he would not permit this sukkah. But if his prohibition is based on a fear that the animal will run away, this animal, if tied, will not run away, so he would permit this sukkah. Not so fast, the Stam says. What if the owner suspends the cow from the ceiling? Then if it dies, it will not crumple to the ground. It will still meet the minimum height required of a valid wall. So even according to the view that Rabbi Meir prohibits animal walls for fear that the animal will die and be too short, maybe he would permit this sukkah because the suspended dead cow will be tall enough. Well, that's possible, the Stam continues. But if the owner suspends the dead cow, there will be spaces between its legs. And a wall isn't a wall if it has large gaps. So Rabbi Meir would prohibit this suspended dead cow wall. Well, the Stam notes the owner could always stuff the spaces with palm and bay branches. True, the stam responds to itself, but carcasses tend to shrink. What if this dead cow's suspended carcass shrinks enough to create a gap between the animal wall and the ceiling? Well, we generally say a gap of up to 4 handbreadths doesn't disqualify a wall, and maybe the owner took shrinkage into account, and he suspended the cow close enough that even with shrinkage, the gap will be less than 4 handbreadths. That's possible, the stam responds, but what if the owner in good faith miscalculated the amount of shrinkage of a cow carcass, and perhaps Rabbi Meir's prohibition of an animal-walled sukkah was designed for and applies only to this specific bizarre case? Perhaps in all other cases, he actually would permit an animal-walled sukkah. This dialectical performance evinces a spirit of play, not just because of its humorous subject matter, and they do laugh at animals a lot, I've discovered in my current research into laughter in the Talmud, but because of certain formal features, the endless what-ifs that propose limiting Rabbi Meir's prohibition to certain increasingly detailed and specific situations. This kind of limitation, by the way, is called an okimta. What if it applies to this narrow case? That's an okimta. What if his prohibition was limited to a certain kind of animal in a certain situation? What if the animal runs away or dies or shrinks or is suspended or has gaps between its legs and on and on? And the game continues because, as is true of any game, the real fun is in the playing. And although the Talmud stops where it stops, there is no genuine sense of closure. We never find out which reason for his prohibition is correct. And there's nothing to prevent us from coming up with yet another contingent detail. What about a goat? The debate is potentially infinite because particularity and contingency are infinite. We also see here the element of performativity or efficacy, of making things and shaping reality. The complicated objections and hypothetical limitations, or okimtas, reshape the teachings and the disputes. Opinions that appear to disagree may actually agree in all but the rarest of cases if we introduce enough conditions. We thought that all animal-walled sukkahs were categorically prohibited by Rabbi Meir and categorically permitted by Rabbi Yehuda. That's how it began. He prohibits and he permits. We thought these were categorical distinctions, but it turns out that they may not be so, and suddenly we're a little less certain of ourselves. The Talmud doesn't press to determine which view of Rabbi Meir's reason is right. It's interested only in which views are possible. You might say, but this discussion is a parody. Surely serious Talmudic discussions of the law are serious attempts to reach certain knowledge and a single truth. So let me make my case with an entirely sober example, typical of literally hundreds of Talmudic discussions. A passage in Bava Metzia discusses the legal acquisition of that which enters one's courtyard. Our ringmaster, the stam, asks whether a minor girl, like an adult, legally acquires objects when they are placed in her courtyard, right, by means of her courtyard. The 3rd century rabbi Reish Lakish says she does not, and his colleague Rabbi Yochanan says she does. These seem to be categorical positions. To explain their disagreement, the stam suggests that they have different ideas of how a courtyard acquires. Perhaps Rabbi Yochanan thinks that a courtyard affects acquisition like my hand in a physical sense by holding the object. And since a minor girl can acquire things by taking them in her hand, he thinks that she can acquire them with her courtyard. Perhaps Reish Lakish thinks that a courtyard affects acquisition like my hand in a metaphorical sense. My hand is really an agent, commissioned to act on my behalf. And so a courtyard acquires objects for me like an agent. And since a minor cannot appoint an agent, Reish Lakish holds that she cannot acquire with her courtyard. A lengthy discussion ensues, questioning whether a courtyard is really like a hand in a physical sense or a hand in a metaphorical sense. Biblical verses are cited, teachings by sages from different periods and lands are adduced. The stam poses objections, responds to its own objections, poses more objections, defending first one view and then the other, until it appears that Rabbi Yochanan will be the winner and the game will be over. But then the Talmud isn't really interested in declaring a winner or ending the game with a single final answer. And so, the passage makes a sudden 180-degree turn. 3 limitations, these okimtas, 3 limitations are proposed, which completely redefine the original dispute. The first of our 3 proposed okimtas limits the disagreement to the case of a found object. Otherwise, they actually agree that her courtyard acquires for her. The second okimta suggests limiting the disagreement to the case of a minor boy, a pretty odd assertion since the statements were explicitly formulated in the feminine form. A third okimta then combines the 2 and concludes, perhaps there was no disagreement at all. Perhaps Reish Lakish's negative view referred to a minor boy whose courtyard does not acquire a found object, and Rabbi Yochanan's positive view referred to a minor girl whose courtyard does acquire a divorce document. And poof, the dispute, which was enough to generate nearly 3 pages of detailed argumentation, and if you know the Talmud, you know that's a lot, and a slew of ever more precise and detailed limitations simply vanishes like magic. We thought that Rabbi Yochanan permitted a minor girl to acquire by her courtyard, and that Reish Lakish prohibited the same, but it turns out that what we thought it was so at the beginning is not necessarily so at the end, and we don't even really necessarily know what each thinks about the case we started with, just about their own new case. And so at the end, with a few more okimtas, things might even look different again. So the elaboration of divine law in the Talmud is both performance and play, and it's a specific kind of performance. It's the kind of performance featured in a comical magic show where every okimta is a wink and the anonymous stam is jester, magician, and illusionist, incongruously conjuring and vanishing objects to the audience's delight. To paraphrase Hamlet, the play's the thing, period. Not because it is nature's mirror reflecting a truer reality, but because the play is the thing, the only reality. And if reality is to continue, the play, the game, must be infinite. I refer to John Carse's distinction between finite and infinite games, and I observe that the Talmud is best understood as the latter, and this is the final piece on your handout. John Carse writes, "A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, an infinite game for the purpose of continuing play. The rules of a finite game are the contractual terms by which the players can agree on who has won. The rules of an infinite game change during the course of play to prevent anyone from winning the game and to bring as many persons as possible into the play. To be serious is to press for a specified conclusion. To be playful is to allow for possibility, whatever the cost to oneself." Kolakowski offered the figure of the jester standing in opposition to the priest, who represents the guardian of the absolute. Reading the rabbis under the sign of the jester helps us understand the rabbinic conception of divine law. Taking aim at the guardians of an immutable divine logos, the rabbis' performance of divine law deployed the destabilizing strategies of play, and these strategies include humor, which delights in incongruity, and dialectical excess, resisting the idea of a transhistorical divine law with its attendant moral and epistemological fixity in the name of an historically embedded divine law with its attendant contingency, uncertainty, and dynamism may be seen as the Talmud's infinite and impertinent jest. Thank you so much for your attention today. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful and thought-provoking assessment. Performance, yeah. I spent a lot of my life doing musical theater, and especially Gilbert and Sullivan and other fun theater, and there was nothing that I liked better than the farce scene. And I feel like you have recast from me the Talmud as farce scene. You're willing to answer a couple of questions. Let me throw out something that I was thinking about in response to your amazing articulation of the Greek view and the Jewish contrast, which is the notion within Jewish law that there are kind of multiple legal systems. So I don't mean multiple legal answers, which is something that you really pointed to all extensively, but as one system of law that is kind of all of the things on the right side of your set of categories, that is not temporally fixed, that is based in the here and now, that is changing, that accommodates human need, and that's for this world. And another set of laws that might theoretically be out there and sometimes is represented by the House of Shammai, which are eternal, much more difficult to live up to, unchanging in a sense. And those are kind of the ideal law that maybe in the Messianic age we'll come back to and be able to follow. And I wonder how this dichotomy fits into.
So, the best of my knowledge, that's a post-Talmudic. There's a story to tell about everything that happens after the 7th century, which, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. So, to a large degree, I stopped my story with the end of the Talmudic period. In the medieval period, Jews are going to once again encounter Greek thought, Greek philosophy, and this time they're going to start to embrace some of it. And we're going to see some real differences. Maimonides, of course, is going to be, the 12th century Philo, and who's going to bring about a synthesis of the two. He's going to do exactly, I argue, what the rabbis resisted. He's going to insist that every single law is rational, and he tries to explain the reason for every single law and admits there are one or two he can't, but he's sure they still have a reason, right? So that's not the Talmud. And it's interesting to see what he does with some of the rabbinic texts that assert that there are non-rational laws and sort of celebrate that. He can't read them that way, and he doesn't read them that way. So some of these ideas that that do creep in the post-Talmudic period, which is why I don't really like to go anywhere past the 7th century. It's all postmodern as far as I'm concerned. Once you get to the 7th century, it's all downhill. So I'm actually trying to elevate what I think is really a very different perspective that was preserved in the Talmudic tradition and has not always been faithfully observed by the subsequent tradition, which has continued to struggle with and encounter. Come the Enlightenment, Jews again are going to make all sorts of rationalist apologetics for the Talmud and their law and be embarrassed by it and so on. And I think all that's really unfortunate, because I think there's something to be said by elevating this countercultural voice that doesn't divinize reason, but recognizes that it's an important and powerful tool, but ultimately has to yield to the good.
And I think we need to talk about the game theory of example number 1. The Talmud was not written by humans. It's well known that it was written by men, and the rabbis are men, as well also Stoics and everybody. And I'm very grateful for the example number 1, because that's the elephant in the room. Sure. The woman there is talking about her sex life. She is entitled to a total privacy. The Talmud itself insists on the total privacy of the women, and there she is talking to Rabbi Akiva with all of the scholars around. Everybody thinks about when you're going to a gynecologist, and all of a sudden the gynecologist calls 10 other gynecologists to be at your gynecological exam. This is a great manifestation of a performance theory, and relates to this example of performance theory, please.
Thank you. I think that many of these texts are written as performative texts. I would hesitate. I recognize that there are actual practices behind some of these things, particularly in the post-Talmudic period. Some of these things which I think may have been written as performative texts, maybe even humorous texts, and the fact that we do or don't find them humorous is not the point. I'm writing a book now on humor in the Talmud, and one of the things I have to do is tell myself, nothing is ever funny, things are only ever funny to someone. So what I'm looking for is what's culturally credible as funny to the rabbis. I look for places where they laugh at something, and I make a list of here are things that are culturally credible laughter triggers to them. Whether they are to us or not is not the point if I want to know what they found funny. And that story has some of the things that would be in my list of culturally credible laughter triggers for the rabbis. It's with a set of other texts in which disciples are looking at rabbis doing things that are intensely private, like being under their marital bed and so on, that I think are actually line up with some other ancient works that do the same sort of thing. So I hesitate a little bit to think about the historicity of this, but I recognize it has been treated as a historical model, and that there is a practice of people showing their bloodstains and talking about these things, obviously, in the Jewish tradition. So I want to be sensitive to that too. I happen to think, though, that the Mishnah as a text there is actually being performative and humorous. Whether, again, we think it's humorous or not is not the point. I'm trying to think what's culturally credible as a humor laughter trigger for them. So that's not really an answer to your question, Chava. It's really more to say that figuring out the genre of these texts and what it is they're trying to do is really, really difficult, particularly because they have ongoing power to shape lives and communities today. That makes it difficult.
Chris, thank you for a really compelling lecture. I'd like to throw into the mix with performance theory, a literary theorist, Bakhtin.
Sure.
I don't know if you thought about it.
Yeah, Thailandism, absolutely.
Well, especially when you touched on the opposition between priest and jester. That is, but Bachtin argues again and again that you have an opposition between epic and novel. Epic corresponding more or less to the Greek notion of divine law. That is, it's a fixed, immutable system. There's only one kind of language you can use, and there are all kinds of subjects that will exclude us. And then there's the novel plus medieval fabliaux and rabelais, in which humor is very important.
Violate all those norms, and it's very humorous.
And you can talk about the lower functions of a body, and things are in flux. That's what I'm saying.
No, absolutely. And that's going to be something I'll be talking about a little bit tomorrow is, and of course, the serio-comic, right? And the genre of the serio-comic and Manichaean satire, the sort of bringing the heavens down to earth and having the gods speak in ordinary jargon instead of their high elevated prose and so on. And one of the things I'll be arguing tomorrow is that that's a really helpful lens for looking at the Talmud, thinking of it as serio-comic. And of course, Daniel Boyarin has really blazed the trail there. But I think if we say only that and leave it there, we haven't said enough, because it assumes a dichotomy between the serious and the comic, that there are two voices and times in which they are seriously striving towards some sort of absolute truth. And my argument is that sometimes that helps and it's useful, but actually I think that it isn't two separate voices. I think there is just the voice of play, and I define play a little bit differently. So it's a useful concept, and it's definitely one I use, and I think the rabbis are participating very much in a genre that was well known. Interestingly enough, it's the Babylonian Talmud that I think really absorbs many of these genres, and Boyarin has already pointed us to Lucian as well, and so I do a lot of work lining up really clear parallels between Talmudic texts and Lucian. But I think that while that is illuminating, we still need something more to account for those times in which serious topics are also dealt with in a spirit of play. And that doesn't quite fit the serio-comic dynamic.
Thanks. We'll take a comment here, but before we do so, I just want to say students always get priority, so think about raising your hand, and also if they're on the
Student over here.
So
What's that? Is that a comment?
I have a question about, there's a Talmudic idea that kind of rejects any time that there's a story that's against the previous law. So that, like a Maaseh, this story, right? And then anytime that there's a story that rejects the law, the Talmud feels they need to reject that Mishnah, or they then say, Kosuri Mexra, we have to find out if the story obviously is in line with the law, which seems to, how does that work with your theory, considering stories admitting to upend these laws?
Wonderful work done by Yonatan Feintuch and others to talk about the many different variegated relationships that the narrative text or Godic material has to the legal material. That's one thing that will be noted sometimes, Maaseh Listor, which then is a challenge. That's throwing down the gauntlet, right? So if this is an action which seems to go against this tradition, what do we do? What do we have to massage? What do we work to make it work out? But not always. I mean, sometimes it's left as it is. Sometimes it's simply not stated. Sometimes there will be a legal teaching and then a narrative text which clearly subverts it or undermines it, but they just don't call attention to it and do anything to it. So sometimes it becomes part of the game and part of what they pick up and then continue to play with to see if they can make it work out. But there's no hard and fast rule, right? And the relationship between the Agadah and the Halakha is quite varied. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
I'm not sure. It seems like the rabbis wouldn't want to be thinking that they're doing this.
Yeah, what do the rabbis want? That's the next book I should write. What do the rabbis want? I don't know. There isn't a uniform treatment of any of these things, and that's one of the things that's so remarkable. There are times when they will do a certain maneuver in a certain kind of situation, and then 2 pages later you have exactly the same situation, and they don't use that maneuver. They allow it to go somewhere else. So I think that these are all just pieces on the chessboard, all tools in their toolkit, and sometimes they use them and sometimes they don't. Yes, there was a question over here.
Hi, I'm Rhoda. I'm the student here. I was wondering if you talk more about speech acts, because I'm very curious about how something like an infinite dialogue could end up constituting a speech act. Like if it is infinite, would it be more like a negation of another law? And then also, who would have been reading these dialogues or creating these dialogues, and then how would how that have been affecting them as a speech act?
So I used the idea of a speech act because I wanted to get at the idea of efficacy, that there are things that we create through our language, our words, our actions. And if we think about law in those terms, then we understand that law isn't necessarily about our working towards some sort of determined legal outcome that is out there for us to discover, that there is some sort of legal answer or some sort of legal truth that is finite and certain. We might just have some sort of epistemological limitations that make it difficult for us, but if we employ reason properly, we can reason our way to it and we can unveil this law that's sitting there. I'm arguing that that's not the conception of law that the rabbis have, that there isn't some fixed law that we're working our way towards uncovering, but that it is generated through the process of discussion, argument, experience, etc. And there are some great stories in which God is participating in that process too, right? So there's the story where God and the angels in the heavenly academy are debating a particular point of purity law, and God has one view and all the angels have another view, and so they say, we really need an expert. So Rabbi Bar Nachmani, he's the real expert when it comes to purity laws. Let's get him. And so they send the angel of death to get him, and the angel of death can't get a foot in the door because he's such a pious person. He never stops studying. You can't kill him. So he has to make the wind rustle in the bushes, so he thinks some Roman soldiers are coming, or Persian soldiers are coming after him. So he's distracted for a minute, and then he can grab him. So God needs help. There's another famous story where God is debating. He's reading a passage in the book of Judges, and trying to figure out something in one of the stories, the story of the concubine, and he cites two different rabbis' opinions. Rabbi so-and-so says this, and Rabbi so-and-so says that about what it was that explains the behavior in this particular story. And somebody says, you're citing the traditions and interpretations of rabbis. So God too is in the process of unfolding things. And like a good rabbi, what he does actually is he comes up with a third view, which is what I love about it. It shows how it is generative. He cites this tradition in the name of these two rabbis, and then he sort of ends up combining them to come up with something new. And so I just think it's such a great example of the way in which Torah is something that is from heaven, but no longer in heaven, in the sense that it's in our hands and it's continuing to be developed and changing. So in that sense, the study, the speech, but even the actions of the sages have an efficacy. They're bringing new things into being and making other things pass away. They're actually generating and creating things, and not, as we often think about law, as trying to get the right answer that exists out there and just needs to be unveiled if we can only find the right process or have the right amount of knowledge. Does that answer that for you?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Hey, I'm a student here, and I was once a student in your classroom as well, 7 years. But yeah,
I was in my 20s.
but yeah, I was curious if the rabbis are really modifying the Bible, or whether they're sort of functionally disabling it but still leaving it intact. And I think of like a story you mentioned at staff about the Ammonite who wants her to marry and use the language of Deuteronomy. Can I enter into the Kahal? And they don't go, yeah, you can enter, it's fine. If you're an Ammonite, it doesn't matter. They go, we don't know if you're really an Ammonite, so the law doesn't apply.
So,
keep the law intact.
Sure, so there are lots and lots of different strategies for developing the law. You're right that they don't erase any letters out of the Hebrew Bible. They certainly don't do that. It has a no amendment clause after all, right? It says in Deuteronomy you can't add a letter or take away a letter. You're stuck with it. This is it. Can't add to it, can't change it. But of course, because it is a closed canon of that type, as Moshe Halbertal has argued, that means that there's tremendous pressure to meet the needs of a changing world through interpretation or maybe legislation, right? And so they do locate in the text permission for themselves to legislate. They find that in Deuteronomy 17. They read themselves into that as the court of the day that you go to if you have a question. So Moses had a hotline to God, right? When he had 4 cases where he didn't know what to do, he says, God, what do I do? God says, I don't know. Let's think about this. And they come up with something together. But after Moses, what are you going to do? So God says explicitly in Deuteronomy 17, here's the mechanism you'll use. You'll go to the authorities of the day and you'll ask, and that's how the law will continue to evolve and develop. So built into the Bible itself is already the means for its continuing development. And there are various mechanisms to achieve those sorts of developments and modifications. Some are outright legislation, right? They make a takana. This word, repair, right? I love it, a takana. We have the same concept in Roman law, where you could also, the praetor could give a takana, basically, the Roman equivalent of a takana to correct the standard civil law. And so they would, and there are even a couple of discussions where they say, can a takana even uproot a biblical law? And there are a couple places where they say, yeah, it kind of can. And they give a couple of examples of where it actually does that. In the Babylonian Talmud, they're not so happy with that. They prefer to do things through interpretation, but it's a very self-conscious, very self-aware interpretation. They're not fooling anybody about what it is they've done. So if you have time for one example, which I promise will not be terribly long, but it's my favorite example. There's the famous case of the stubborn and rebellious son, which many of you will be familiar with. This is a law in Deuteronomy that says if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who doesn't heed him, doesn't listen to him, then he takes him out. He and the father and the mother take him out to the gates where the elders sit, and they say, this son of ours is a glutton and a drunkard. He will not obey us. He will not listen to us, and the community will hear, and they will stone him to death, right? Pretty harsh law, but it was an improvement on just the right of the head of household to kill, without any consultation of any community at all. So it was trying to subject it to some sort of civil procedure and have this to be a communal act. By the time of the rabbis, this was seen as unpalatable, to say the least. And so they subject it to a wonderful process of interpretation. If a man has a son and not a daughter, so right away it's limited to half of the population of children. A son meaning a child, but children are not liable under the law. So it must refer to someone who's on the cusp of becoming a man, meaning someone who's 13 years old, but of course once he's sexually mature, then he's a man and no longer a son. And that usually happens with the development of pubic hair, which happens around 13 years and 3 months. So basically the window of opportunity for prosecuting somebody under this law is from the age of 13 to 13 and 3 months, or if he sexually matures before that, it might even shorten it, 50,000 miles or 5 years, whichever comes first, right? That kind of. So that's it. And then, of course, it has to be that he ate at least 20 ounces of Italian wine. It has to be Italian wine because that's undiluted and very strong, because they say he's a drunkard and a glutton, and he also has to eat a certain amount of meat, and it has to be raw, and it has to be stolen from his father and eaten off the property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And both the mother and the father have to want to prosecute, and they can't have any injuries in their hands because it says they will take their son, so they have to be able to take him perfectly well. They also can't be deaf or mute because they say he will not listen to our voice, which means they have to be able to speak, and they have to have also no injuries because they can't be blind because they say this our son. That means they have to be able to point him out. They can see. Anyway, it goes on and on and on. After they spend many, many pages basically limiting the application of this law, they say there never has been and there never will be a stubborn and rebellious son, right? Very self-consciously. And they say, then why was this law written? So that you would study it and earn reward. So that you would go through this process of moral reasoning that we just went through and earn reward. And then Rabbi Shimon says, because a kid eats a lot of meat and drinks a bunch of wine, he should be stoned. Never has been and never will be. In other words, he gives voice to the moral outrage. There's a sense that this law is not good. That's all. It's just not good. It doesn't make sense. And just gives voice to that moral outrage. Therefore, why was it given? So that you would study and earn reward. But my favorite is the very last line, Rabbi Yonatan. While the rabbis seem to be congratulating themselves for their moral vision, and they are absolutely certain that this law is terrible and they would never want to do it, Rabbi Yonatan says, I saw him and I sat on his grave. There was one time in all of history. Don't be so damn sure about yourselves either. There might be one time in all of history that this law was actually the better thing to do, the kinder thing to do, the more right thing to do. Don't be so sure. And I love that story because it's the rabbis taking aim at their own moral absolutism, right? We are guided by our best lights and our best vision, but we have to remember too, there might come a time when we wish we had that law, right? So, but I think they're self-conscious about the mechanisms that they use to do this. They know they're changing things radically, right? They have that wonderful story of Moses going up to get the Torah. God's putting the little calligraphic figures on it. And he says, what are you doing that for? He says, well, there's going to be a rabbi who's going to, expound heaps of laws on those little tittles. And he says, really, let me see him. And he sits in the back of Rabbi Akiva's schoolhouse in the 8th row with the dummies. There were 7 rows of smart students and then the dummies. Moses is with the dummies. Rabbi Akiva's up there attaching laws to the Torah in all sorts of ways, and he can't understand what's going on. He gets very depressed until finally when the students say, hey, what about this law? Can you attach this to the Bible? And he says, no, that one I can't. That one was given as a law to Moses at Sinai. That one we just accepted. Moses felt a little relieved, and he goes back to God and he says, you have this man and you're giving the Torah by me, right? And he says, be silent, such is my decree. And he says, well, then show me his reward. And he shows him being flayed alive by the Romans in the marketplace. He says, this is his reward for such Torah? Be silent, for such is my decree. But they have this aching sense that the Torah in the hands of the rabbis, Moses wouldn't recognize it. They know how distant it is. They know what they've done, how they've developed it and created it. That Moses, the man who gave it to Israel, would not recognize it in the hands of Rabbi Akiva. Whoops, looks like there's one more.
Professor Hayes had a question about Your thoughts around the implications on Israel today?
So as I said, anything past the 7th century, it is bad enough that I have to live in the modern world. I don't want to study it. Anything I would have to say would be completely uninformed and unhelpful.
With that, please let's give a real round of applause.